Hello, welcome to Radical Engagements and a brief temporary series that I'm doing over the summer, responding to groups that I have some relations with. So there'll be primarily materials by either Cosmonaut Magazine and the Marxist Unity group. I've never been a member of them, but I've had lots of exchanges with them through the years. Art will be with Chris Cutrone and Platypus Affiliated Society / Sublation Magazine. Because I keep on getting asked questions about them, and I feel like it leads to disingenuous engagement. Also, there's a lot of claims made about them being too soft on the right, etc., some of which I think may be substantive, some not, and there's been a flattening out of people's positions, where positions taken by Doug Lane are seen as being the same, and by Ashley Frawley are seen by being the same as Chris Cutrone's. They're all different. I might not agree with them, but they are all different. Now, I want to go into a couple of things first. I need to give a caveat here. My specific relationship with the Platypus Affiliated Society is I was a member from 2011 to 2013. Well, I think I joined at the end of 2011. I became a fellow traveler while I was in South Korea working at the University of Hankook de Hakyo. While I was there, I had been involved as a fellow traveler of the Socialist Party of the USA back when Alexander was running for the presidential campaign there, but was frustrated with various left events leading up to Occupy. When Occupy happened, I was involved in Occupy Yoedo, which is the banking district outside of Seoul, and in Occupy Taipei, where I visited in the March of that year. In the winter of that year, at the end of the occupations in New York, when things were heading down, I was on family and business leave and traveling across the country, and went to New York City to meet the chapter head where I started, which was led by Pamela Nogales, who was at the time the head of one of the New York chapters of Platypus Affiliated Society, and where my chapter, where me and a woman that I met there named Carrie Graham had set up in Seoul. That's a lot of superfluous information. Needless to say, I was involved with Platypus Affiliated Society from 2011 to 2013. I left not unacrimoniously, but I was not kicked out, nor did I denounce the group, nor leak anything from the group, although people around me at the North Star did. The first major Platypus scandal is when a co-editor at North Star Magazine leaked the Platypus member email group to the ISO. The ISO published parts of it, I think somewhat unfairly and out of context, or at least members of the ISO did. The second Platypus affiliated scandal came with the Why Not Trump article, which I have covered over at Sublation Magazine's version of Pop the Left. I believe it's in a parent room, though, so I may cover it again eventually. I found that article was not nearly as scandalous as initially was claimed, and I wanted to go through that piece and talk about where I disagree with it. And there are quite a few places where I did disagree with it, but that I thought when people were saying it was an outright endorsement of Trump, that it was a different deal than that exactly. I took it as being ambiguous. It could be read as an endorsement of not caring about Trump and thus tacitly allowing victory, or even read as an argument against forming any popular front against Trumpism, as it wasn't actually the threat it was represented to be. I think to some degree, those two statements can be taken in various ways, but they're not an outright endorsement of Trump. However, that does not necessarily mean that one can sign on to that unproblematically. And as I've said, my critique of Platypus Affiliated Society has been generally not that they are tailing the right wing exactly, although certain members have, I think. I'm not going to go into who, but it has not any of the main members that speak to the public. It has not Chris or Spencer or any of the other major members like Lori Rojas or Pamela Nogales. But that in some ways, I think that they have given the right the benefit of the doubt as an overcorrective to the, frankly, sometimes misrepresentations presented of the right on the left. Now, I think that could be a tactical mistake, but nonetheless, we are interested in truth, so we should deal with truth. Another thing to deal with when we're talking about platypus-affiliated society and Chris Cutrone is what Chris Cutrone claims he's doing. Chris has said, as the chief pedagogue of platypus-affiliated society, that his goal is to build up a theoretical and educational apparatus to show the left to itself so that its contradictions can emerge, and that his lineage for what original Marxism goes from Marx of the First International and the early SPD's foreign correspondence group up through the Second International into the Third International and Lenin and the Bolsheviks, through the early parts of Trotsky, but we're going to say Trotsky, not Trotskyism per se, because Platypus has a critique of Trotskyism as such, both its, quote, Stalinophilic and Stalinophobic branches, so its Soviet defensist and anti-Soviet condemnatory branches, and then into the Frankfurt School. Now, there's also a way in which people attribute more coherence to the theory of what platypus-affiliated society is doing than is probably wise. There are not ideological grounds for being a member of platypus-affiliated society. Your job in Platypus is to read the reading list, do the work, engage in the production of the Platypus Review, and in the pedagogical panels. It is not a political project as such. It is not the party project, although Platypus members are definitely sometimes encouraged to do that. Both the attempt to go into the Socialist Party of the USA, which I think a couple of people did in Platypus-affiliated society, and the attempt to found a new Socialist Party in the United States has largely not gone very far. And they're separate initiatives, and Chris and Spencer and the other leaders of Platypus make sure that those initiatives stay separate. So I want that to be said as clear as possible. I'll also say that Chris's thought has developed since I was in Platypus-affiliated society. While certain key ideas of regression, the bourgeois revolution, the importance of the bourgeois revolution for the Marxist revolution, these were strongly talked about in Platypus when I was in the organization. In fact, one of my critiques is almost too typologically, as if these eras of development were just descended on from on high. But that wasn't really their point. And there have been times about the left where I think Platypus and Chris in particular have been pretty accurate about blind spots or incongruities or problems that really need to be dealt with. Now, so for me, I do not generally support electoral popular fronts. I'm not even sure I always agree with electoral united fronts. Although if there are united fronts of coalitions of socialist and communist parties, etc., that these need to have a pretty strong theoretical and problematic basis for them, and they need to be broadly supported by the class. But I am comfortable with united fronts with non-communist and non-socialist workers groups, etc., but not so much parties that have party apparatuses that do the same. Now, I have accused Platypus of being soft on, although not necessarily doing, an inverted tailism, like tailing the right as an overcorrection against the left. Now, I'm not sure that we can say that what they're actually doing is that, but I can say that my critique has been that they give the right a benefit of the doubt that they often don't give the left, almost as an overcorrective. But we have to stick with claims here. Now, I'm covering this article pretty thoroughly. And I'm going to have to make some references to get into some specific claims. So we're going to get into this as closely as I can here. All right. Why Not Trump Again by Chris Cutrone. This was presented on April 5th, 2024 at the opening plenary panel discussion on liberal democracy in crisis, the Platypus Affiliated Society's 15th Annual International Convention with Jordin de Anda for the People, Howie Hawkins, U.S. Green Party, Ralph Leonard, author of works at Unheard, Arrow, etc., and Matt McManus, author of Political Theory of Liberal Socialism. All right, let's get into this. And I'm going to have to make some specific claims here because I think in some ways, even though I don't necessarily disagree with a large part of what's made in the second paragraph, I have to go way more specific than this does. All right. Let's begin with Cutrone's words. I strongly identify with the wrongly accused, and so does America more broadly. Okay, fair. And Trump has been wrongly accused. Okay, of what exactly? If you are in the right, there's no need to lie. And they have lied about Trump. Okay, automatically, right there, that's a rhetorical trick. Who's they? That's a free-floating pronoun reference without being clear about who it refers to. Now, who it refers to? Well, grammatically, it would be if you are right, then there is no need to lie, and they have lied about Trump. So presumably the they there are those who have lied about Trump, but who has lied here? Who's being accused of lying? Is it the Biden administration? Is it the liberal media? Is it liberals in general? Is it the left? Whatever that means. Which parts of the left and why? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, you might go, well, how is this going to be different than MAGA communism or patriotic socialism and that right? Well, we'll get into that in a minute. But I don't know who the they is. So right now, I don't know how meaningful that claim can be. But let's get into the next claim because that's actually going to be a point of contention. It's one that I initially thought was an overclaim, but I think may sadly have some truth to it. All the criminal and civil lawsuits against Trump, literally every single one of them, are using novel legal theories and unprecedented applications of the law. This is not because he was once president and no president has been tried previously. Anyone sued or prosecuted this way would be in the same untested waters of injustice. It's a good rhetorical term there. And it is injustice. The idea of liberal democracy is rights come before the law. Yeah, although the way that was justified in liberal democracy is historically natural law. But we'll come back to that in a minute. Because there's no way that I believe that Chris Cutrone believes in natural law. Or unalienated human rights as metaphysically grounded in the liberal tradition. I don't see how you do that once you no longer believe in God and the Lockean provisos, which as a Marxist, you know, is at least rendered only a methodological question. And at the very minimum precludes any references to divine categories, if not outright prohibits them. But let's get back into the claim about novel legal theories. Now, I'm going to go to Vox here, and I'm actually going to cover it fairly. And I'm going to talk about here the case that Bragg has made on Trump. And I'm going to read a large part of a Vox article that I'm going to link in the show notes, and I'm going to call up so that you can get that, you know, however you feel about Cutrone, he's not really misrepresenting this, at least in the case of the most recent case where 34 felony counts were applied to Trump and he was found guilty of them. Okay. Why do I think that's an issue? Well, we'll come back to that in a minute. This is not to exonerate Trump of wrongdoing. I actually do think he is guilty of wrongdoing, but I think that it is actually more complicated here, and even liberal news sources admit it, which is why I'm using Vox. This cannot be said to be biased towards Trump. Okay, so let's get into this. This is from an article called "The Dubious Legal Theory at the Heart of the Trump Indictment Explained." All right. There is something painfully anticlimactic about the Manhattan District Attorney's Alvin Bragg's indictment of former President Trump. It concerns not Trump's effort to overthrow the duly elected government of the United States, but his alleged effort to cover up a possible extramarital affair with a porn star. And there's a very real risk that this indictment will end up in a even bigger anticlimax. It is unclear that a felony statute that Trump is accused of violating actually applies to him. Now, I want to say that this has technically been legally settled at this point until the appeals case, but in the appeals case, we'll see how it goes. So right now, just speaking in terms of legal standing, a jury has found Trump guilty of the 34 felony indictment charges. And I think technically he is probably guilty of them from the evidence that I've seen too. However, I'm going to caveat this. This is still based on a novel legal theory, and we're going to have to go into that. All right. The indictment charges against Trump with 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree, a felony. A separate document laying out the factual basis for Black's allegations against Trump points to a complicated web of arrangements between Trump, his former lawyer Michael Cohen, and David Packard, the CEO of American Media, the company that publishes the National Enquirer. Bragg alleges that these three men worked together to identify two women who allegedly had sex with Trump and to pay them to remain silent. The first woman identified as Woman 1 and Woman 2 by Bragg, but the first woman appears to be a former Playboy model, Karen McDougal, and the second appears to be porn actress Stormy Daniel. Cohen, who pleaded guilty to federal campaign finance crime arising out of this scheme in 2018, paid $130,000 to Daniel shortly before the 2016 election in order to secure her silence. According to Bragg, Trump then paid Cohen a total of $420,000 over the course of 2017, much of which was intended to reimburse Cohen for the payments to Daniel. The actual felony counts arise out of the allegedly false entries that Trump made into various business records in order to make the payments to Daniels appear to be ordinary legal expenses paid to Cohen. But Bragg built his case on an exceedingly uncertain legal theory. And like I said, Trump's been convicted on it, so it is now case law. But it was weird case law, and we need to look at that, straight up. And again, Vox, not a source known for being kind to Trump. Even if Trump did the things he's accused of, it's not clear how Bragg can legally charge Trump for them, at least under the felony version of New York's false records law. Now, again, this has technically been settled now until the appeals go through. As Mark Pomerantz, a former prosecutor in the Manhattan DA's office who played a significant role in Trump's investigation prior to his resignation in 2022, wrote in a recent book, a key legal theory that will determine whether Trump can be charged under the felony version of New York's false records law has never been resolved by any appellate court in the state of New York. So the appeals have to go through for this to stand. The felony statute requires Bragg to prove that Trump falsified records to cover up a crime. Bragg has evidence that Trump acted to cover up a federal crime, but it's not clear that Bragg is allowed to point to a federal crime in order to charge Trump and the New York state law. The answer to this gnarly legal question, as Pomerantz puts it, is simply unknown, since there's a serious risk that a New York judge will toss out the charges against Trump on technical legal grounds unrelated to the former president's actual conduct. And even if Bragg's legal team convinces New York's own court, which it did, that the prosecution was able to move forward, which it did, there's also a very real danger that the Supreme Court of the United States, with its GOP-appointed supermajority, could decide that it needs to weigh in on whether Trump should be shielded from prosecution. That's a separate question. Not a great one, as people have talked about. The Supreme Court has long held under the doctrine of rule of leniency that fair warning should be given to the world in the language that common to the world will understand of what a law intends to do if a certain line is passed. Thus, when the meaning of a criminal statute is unclear, the Constitution sometimes requires a statute to be read narrowly because an unclear criminal law does not give a potential defendant fair warning when their conduct was illegal. Now, I'm going to say that the Supreme Court's been awfully inconsistent on this principle, but nonetheless, it's a principle that protects defendants, and arguably the left should like that, regardless of who the defendant is. Using courts in a juridical manner just to get revenge is generally bad suit for rule of law. The court is divided about whether the leniency rule should apply, whether it provides more protection to all criminal defendants, but if on the current slate of justices decide that they must have a final word on whether Bragg may prosecute Trump, this could easily invoke the rule of leniency to asserting the Supreme Court's jurisdiction over the case. Now, we've already seen that this was passed on since this article was written, but nonetheless, it could still come up as there's going to be appeals to the New York verdict, and we know that. Bragg, in other words, has built one of the most controversial and high-profile criminal cases in American history upon uncertain foundations, and these foundations could crumble to dust if the courts reject his legal argument on a generally ambiguous question of law. Bragg's legal theory against Trump, briefly explained. In October 2016, while Trump was at the heights of the first presidential campaign, porn actress Stormy Daniels was reportedly preparing to come forward with an allegation that she had sex with Trump in 2006. In an apparent attempt to squash the story, Trump's then lawyer Michael Cohen paid Daniels $130,000. Trump then reimbursed Cohen for the payment over the course of 2017. Cohen later pleaded guilty to the federal finance campaign violations arising out of this scheme. The idea behind the prosecution was that because this money was spent to prevent a damaging story from emerging while Trump was campaigning for federal office, it should have been disclosed as a campaign expense and should have been subject to the limits on campaign donations. In other words, Trump is not being charged for the payments to Stormy Daniels themselves. Most of the time, paying someone to keep quiet about something is not a crime. Bingo. He is being charged with nor is he being charged with campaign finance violations either. After Trump left office in 2021, federal prosecutors reportedly considered charging Trump with campaign finance violations, but they ultimately decided against it, probably because the case was weak. Instead, Trump is accused of violating a state law that makes it a crime to falsify big business records with an attempt to defraud, and doing so specifically to conceal another crime, the federal legal violation at the heart of Cohen's conviction. If that sounds convoluted, well, because it is. This convoluted approach may be necessary if Bragg wants to charge Trump with a felony, of which he was now found guilty of 34 of them. Ordinarily, falsifying business records in this way is only a misdemeanor under New York law, meaning that it's considered to be a minor crime that is only punishable by up to a year in prison. But someone accusing of falsifying business records may be charged with a felony if their intent to defraud includes the intent to commit another crime or to aid in the concealment of the commission thereof. But the crime, what is the crime here? Well, the crime is not having sex with Stormy Daniels. That's not illegal. That's not even paying Stormy Daniels hush money. That's only illegal in the case that hush money is in a criminal or a civil case, which it was not. It is that it was done with sketchy booking. It's a blue-collar crime. In a vague statement made after Trump's arraignment, Bragg claims the concealed word scheme violated New York's election law, which makes it a crime to conspire to promote a candidacy by unlawful means. But this legal theory is not mentioned at all in the indictment or the accompanying statements of fact. This leaves a federal campaign finance violation that led Cohen's guilty plea, but it is far from clear that New York State's prosecutor may charge Trump with the felony because he tried to cover up a federal as opposed to a state crime. As Ponderance writes in his recent book, the felony statute is ambiguous, so it refers to another crime. It does not say whether this crime may be a federal criminal act or only an act that violates New York's own criminal code. Worse, Ponderance writes, no appellate court in New York has ever upheld or rejected this interpretation of the law. It just hasn't come up before. It is novel. Now, novel doesn't mean a lie, though, and as I said, a jury has found Trump guilty, so it's a little bit harder to argue than it probably was in April. But I gotta admit, this is a very convoluted prosecutorial case, and I'm not usually big on letting prosecutors build convoluted cases. This is not to say that Trump is not guilty of wrongdoing. Fuck, I mean, I assume all presidents are guilty of wrongdoing, but this is kind of a pathetic way to build the case and a pathetic way to build the case at hand. It is also possible that Bragg will try to link Trump to a second federal crime allegedly committed by Pecker and his company. As Bragg noted, Pecker's company entered into a non-prosecution agreement with the federal against the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York in connection with the AMI's payoff of Woman 1. But linking Trump to a second federal crime does not solve the legal problem, which could blow up his felony case. And again, this is not yet solved until it goes through either an appeals court or the Supreme Court. This does not mean that Bragg will lose. In fact, he did not. But it does mean that we'll have to convince New York courts to adopt a more expansive reading of the felony statute in order to sustain a conviction. Now, this was from last year at about this time, in April of 2023. All right. So we can see here that, yes, Cutrone is right, at least in the case of which Trump has been found guilty. The case is novel and kind of weird. Back to the article. The idea of liberal democracy is that rights come before the law. Now, this, again, remember, implies natural law theories of rights. Natural law theories of rights are religious. They are based on the idea that human rights are rights before God. are that they are emergent from nature in obvious ways, but this gets conflated because most legal theories today do not have this as a grounding before the law. So you have the contradictory of rights that come before the law, but that are defined legally and are legally prescribed. The idea of justice as above the law requires a coherent metaphysical and social analysis of what justice is, and frankly, that doesn't really exist right now. Most of those things are hard to justify in a Marxist framework, since Marxists do not tend to believe in God for a variety of reasons, or at least at minimum necessarily methodologically exclude theological claims. Anyway, back to the thing here. Even those proven guilty have rights, and that includes the right not to be prosecuted if you are indeed guilty of the crime with which you are accused. That's true. That's called prosecutorial discretion. But that right's not your right. That's a prosecutor's right. Even if you had criminal intent and deliberately did wrong, prosecuting you can violate your rights. Yes, particularly if substantive due process was not given, or if it violates other due process rights. For example, in the case of this Trump case, there's a 2-year statute of limitations on charging people for misdemeanor falsifications of business records, and a 5-year one for charging people on falsification of business records for felony charges. So just to point that out there. So a lot of this is going to be really based on whether or not these novel theories play out. Now, I say they're novel. There's nothing dishonest about them exactly. Remember that Cutrone accused this of being a lie. That's a pretty specific claim, and one that a court has now rejected, that a jury of Trump's peers has rejected. So that still doesn't mean that the legal theory which Bragg pursued is valid. That's going to be decided by an appeals court, more than likely, if not it's not the Supreme Court itself. All right. There is a choice and a decision involved in prosecution. Prosecutorial discretion means that the choice not to do so can serve the ends of justice. Asterisk. I mean, this is both superficially true, although the ends of justice here, as not decided by the law, but as some other thing beyond it, is still vague. And I have to admit here, Chris is being predominantly rhetorical, but this is a speech, so, and a polemical speech at that. So, rhetoric is to be expected. Nonetheless, there is a choice here. There is a choice and decision involved in prosecution, that it is not automatic, given the air of arbitrariness and hence injustice. Okay, so arbitrariness is equated to injustice here. Now, I actually think that that's a fair equation. It is hard to have a sense of justice, whatever your definition is, if there's not key procedures and legal proceedings of how this goes. However, we're gonna just say a jury of Trump's peers quickly decided that he was guilty. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean Bragg's legal theory is going to hold up. This is indeed part of the point of a criminal trial, to prove that the state has the right, so to speak, to violate your rights, and an injustice will be allowed by the representatives of the people who are thus shown to be responsible for it. What? All right. This is indeed the case, that the point of a criminal trial is to prove that the state has a right, so to speak, to violate your rights. Yes, that since you have violated the law of the state, your rights are no longer sacrosanct. That is the legal theory. And injustice will be allowed by the representatives of the people, and thus to be shown, and thus shown to be responsible for it. In this case, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness will not be respected. So this is a very bourgeois legal theory, and I do think Cutrone needs to deal with the fact that this is undergirded in natural law, which I don't suspect he believes in. But nonetheless, as a bourgeois right, this is a fair enough statement of the way that the bourgeois conceptions of law in the 19th century were supposed to work. It is understood that the law and the state that enforces it are inherently violators of your rights, of everyone's rights. Yes, that is the case. The state is, by definition, a monopoly of the use of force, and the use of force is a violation of rights. Critics of Trump's persecution are correct that it is a Stalinist Beria-style show me the man and I will find the crime, targeting not of the offense, but of the person whose guilt is presumed. It does seem kind of post hoc. This is contrary to the presumption of innocence that favors the rights of the accused, including the right not to be investigated, let alone charged at all. Who will defend such rights? The people, certainly not the state. Right. Again, these are conceptions of bourgeois rule, but these are vagaries. The people is vague here. So the people here refers to whom? Well, in the case of the people, generally the representatives of the people is a jury of your peers, and they found Trump guilty. I don't know how else to parse that. Now, that doesn't mean the legal theory is valid. I'm going to point that out. That's got to be settled probably by an appellate court. So, of course, Trump is going to appeal it, but God knows how long that's going to take, and none of this is going to affect his ability to run for president next. Anyway, it might affect his likeliness to run, and I'm not even sure it's going to do that. I mean, his likeliness to win, not to run, but I'm not even sure it's going to do that. I actually think it may help him for the reasons identified above. It's free publicity, if nothing else, right? In the U.S., the trial favors the defendant, not so elsewhere where it favors the state. That is true. There's lots of places where the state where guilt is presumed. When found not guilty before the law, defendant is thus found to be innocent, which can never be proved. It's not found to be innocent, which can never be proved, but merely culpable in the eyes of the state. The state is prevented from punishing you, but it does not find that you did no wrong. That's also true. That's a correct legal theory. This is why a defendant who is not found guilty in a criminal court can still be sued civilly and subject to civil judgment. Courts do not decide the morality, only the law, legal liability, and only criminal law and civil law, which are separate cases. So one can be found, say, civilly guilty, such as O.J. Simpson, but not criminally guilty, and that is not a case of double jeopardy. Okay, let's continue. So these are all true statements, at least in this paragraph. A jury votes on whether or not the state is permitted to violate your rights. That is democracy. It's a representational form. This is why a jury can say, regardless of whether the state has proved its case beyond a reasonable doubt or not, you are not being held guilty before the law, even if you did indeed do the crime of which you are committed. That is jury nullification. That is also a highly contentious legal theory, but one that I think is implied in bourgeois rights. We don't like this, but it is what freedom requires. The law is not absolute. None of the facts amount to judgments. This is why factual innocence is not a legal defense in the appeal of a conviction. Yeah, that's fucked up, but it's true. If the law has been followed and the facts are immaterial, for the people have decided to hold you accountable anyway. That's what the jury of your peers is for. But you can always be pardoned. The law and the people can convict you, and you can still be relieved of responsibility. The chief executive can do otherwise. Your rights, even as a guilty person, can be vindicated ultimately. In a criminal trial, are present the three branches of government. The U.S. constitutional republic that we hear so much about, it is a democratic republic, even if not simply a democracy. The executive branch elected to enforce the law is president and the prosecutor, although that is not always an elected position, it depends on state. The judicial branch and the judge, and the people as a jury of your peers. All interpret the law, all decide whether or not how the law will be applied, if at all. That is correct. In the separation of checks and balances in a divided government, the legislature is composed of the representatives of the people who make the laws. But since it is the representatives and not direct democracy, the people are supposed to continually decide on whether the laws actually represent them. This is why they are constantly revised and why representatives are constantly replaced, or at least hypothetically are supposed to be, though in practice most serve intermittently entrenched in office. But who actually writes the laws in an advanced capitalism? Finally, something that's not just bourgeois. Not the legislative representatives themselves are their staff, but corporate lobbyists and government bureaucrats. Yep, definitely now. Don't disagree with Cutrone there. Laws so elaborate and complex that the public cannot understand them. But only those same bureaucrats and corporate agents who game the legal system that they themselves create. In other words, their sophistry prevails, but that violates what's supposed to be the spirit of the law. Yeah, it does. And it does across the board, not just about Trump. I'm not going to cry crocodile tears for Trump, but I do think that legal representation has its own recourse. The legislative representatives judge the will of the people in writing the law. The executives interpret the law and make decisions about it, enforcing it or not. And the judicial branch judges whether the execution of law accords with rights, and indeed, whether themselves are rights. They both review the law itself as well as its execution. All are elected, are understood to be political in nature, namely that they are functioning as consulting the polis in their action. That depends on the state. Not all judges are elected, although I guess you can say all have some accountability to elections, because even judges that are not elected are appointed by people who are, in theory. So there we go. Let us continue. The law does not have a divine but only human status. Yeah, but that's also true for rights, friend. Provisional, fallible, revisable, imperfect, and hence fundamentally unjust. I mean, okay, there is a almost Platonic notion of justice here. This rhetorical strategy is interesting, and I think true enough in terms of bourgeois law, but I don't have a definition of justice here. It's presumed, and presumed before the law, but on what metaphysical, socio-political, or mode of production grounds? We'll have to come back to that. In a criminal trial, justice is not to be achieved, but only in the best byproduct of the application of the law. It is justice in the application of the law that is in the issue, not justice for the crime, which is impossible, as God says, vengeance is mine. Well, it would help if God existed. But leaving the rhetorical use of God and which God aside, this is why I don't make a lot of hay with justice claims, because who decides what justice is? Law is not sufficient, nor is fairness, nor is revenge. And okay, back to the thing. In modern, that is to say, bourgeois society, is understood that law does not make society, but society makes the law. Society does not serve the state, but the state serves society. I mean, that's what bourgeois people tell themselves. Whether that's true is a different deal. The U.S. is not a democracy, not like Athens, in which the state was society and society was the state. Well, the state was society and society was the state if you were a free landowner and male. But nonetheless, for citizens, which was a special subcategory of society, not all of it, yes, it was a direct democracy, but a constitutional republic. Moreover, the Constitution is interpreted according to the principles of the Declaration of Independence, according to the principles of the American Revolution. Okay, this is a big claim. It is a contested claim that you can even invoke the Declaration of Independence as a legal document for the United States after the establishment of the Constitution. This is a very unproblematic assertion made by Chris that I don't think can be made unproblematically, because the courts are not consistent in that. Which is not to say that they don't sometimes accept the legal rubric of the Declaration of Independence as the foundational document that establishes the need for the country, and thus the foundational document of the constitutional republic, but it does precede the constitutional republic. So we'll go there. Also, there's rights that you don't have. I've never seen the Supreme Court, for example, really justify something in pure right to life, or even really adjudicate what that exactly means. I'm sure a lawyer could correct me if I am wrong there, so please do. But in an ideal sense, and one of my complaints about a lot of my time in Platypus is it was arguing from ideals, this is more or less true. At least a goodly portion of American jurisprudence assumes that the Declaration of Independence is a foundational document under which we should interpret the Constitution. It is not a democracy because it is not the rule of the people, but rather the rule of law. And the rule of law is not identical with the rule of society. There are civil rights, meaning the rights of civil society against the state and against the laws the state enforces. Yes, but ultimately also those are delimited by the state itself, which is a problematic delimitation. These rights are unalienable. Don't get me started on that. You can never lose your rights, but you only have them abrogated, violated. Yes. Although, again, what justifies these rights without recourse to natural law? And again, Chris is silent on this. Because even bourgeois society today does not justify itself in the bourgeois society of the 1700s. There's not a consistent theological base for doing so. Which is not to say that the founding fathers were theologically consistent. They weren't. They were a gaggle of deists, Christians, and maybe one or two atheists. But nonetheless, the general framework for the rights that they were guaranteed originally under British common law was religious notions of natural right, usually as interpreted through deistic interpretations. Nobody, and I do mean nobody, holds them as legal grounding anymore. Because even people who do think that we have long since served the purpose of being able to enforce that with the current legal order. So the people who do believe in natural rights tend to think the United States is out of sync with it. But very few people do, even very few conservatives. And these rights are not only for citizens, but are human rights. Well, it depends on which ones we're talking about again. They apply to everyone where the Constitution holds sway. Most of the time, yes. The U.S. is not a nation state. Absolutely true. But the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution are understood to apply to everywhere and everyone, at least where feasible, the scope and reach of the revolution, a.k.a. the jurisdiction of states in the United States government. There's a lot of rhetoric going on here. And there's a lot of not dealing with the fact that some of these early bourgeois notions and Marxist ones, even if the Marxist ones emerge out and valorize some of these bourgeois rights, the justifications for them are fundamentally different. And this is not addressed in this piece so far at all. In fact, very little of this has been about Trump. It's about bourgeois legal theory. And in a very ideal typological set, not in a case study set. This is an argument from ideal type. And, from ideal type of the founders, but nonetheless, it's an argument from ideal type. All right. But again, I agree that this is what the founders thought the function of the law pretty much was. That I can also see why a lot of people accuse the platypus of being neoconservative sympathetic because of this right here. The Constitution are understood to apply to everywhere and to everyone, at least where feasible, the scope and reach of the revolution. And so the only bourgeois revolution here, the revolution is the American Revolution. That's what's implied in this. Chris is going to have to clarify that. Or admit that that's what he says. That's going to be slightly harder for me to reconcile with Marxism, but I'm sure Chris can point to me where he thinks it would be. Nonetheless, this is normally a conservative argument because of the presumption of natural rights and because natural rights are rooted in natural law, which is rooted in a theological conception of the inalienability of rights because they come from God. If you do not agree on what that God is, or even if that God exists, and thus all basis for natural law becomes a lot more tenuous. One cannot take the theories of evolution to argue for natural law in the way that the early bourgeois founders did. And in fact, that was part of the reason why so many Americans were afraid of it. Anyway. The U.S. constitutional order and system is revolutionary. It is expansive and ever deepening. Okay, these are just assertions. The U.S. constitutional order emerges from a revolution. Sure. It is expansive and ever deepening. Hard to reconcile that with the regression thesis, Chris, but I would love to hear you do that. Why does the regression thesis only apply to the left and not to bourgeois society as a whole? That seems to be a serious question. One that I have never, and I'm going to just say, never been satisfied with an answer I've gotten for them. So I'm asking Chris directly because I have a strong feeling he's going to listen to this. How does regression apply to this? Not just its ideal instantiation. This was my initial complaint. Chris's complaint against me, so people know that was both symptomatic, partially educated, whatever that fucking means, and more problematically, but interestingly, too materialistic, are undialectically materialist. So, just so you know, the three things that I was accused of. Now, admittedly, he accused me of that 10 years ago. Although the me being symptomatic, I think, is recently, and they even said it to my face, so that's fun. We continue to recognize and explore the full dimensions of rights of freedoms. This is not a local but a worldwide phenomenon. The revolution has the power to protect all escaped slaves on its free soil and beyond, although we don't. I mean, again, this seems to be an argument from ideal type, and one that is strangely, so far, without reference to class at all, except for bourgeois society as a whole. Do people still believe it? People around the world do. Perhaps some haven't heard it yet. That is somewhere they have been recognized as free. That's that's almost a religious assertion. I don't even know how to deal with that. I'm going to say that I think this is not as good of an argument as the first Why Not Trump article, but nonetheless, we haven't really talked about Trump much. Citizen Trump is trying to go back to Washington. Who is trying to stop him? Certainly not the people, at least not all of them, perhaps not even a majority. Well, the polls bear that out. I'll give him that. Liberal democracy means, unlike ancient democracy, recognizing and protecting the rights of minorities against the majority. By that, as stated in the Federalist Papers by Madison, the majority of wealthy against the poor. That was the initial instantiation, and I know Chris knows this. That's said explicitly in the Federalist Papers. And not least, there are civil rights against the law voted by the majority. And this includes the minority of one, a single person with whom no one agrees, nonetheless has rights against everyone else. Do we still believe it? And the answer is probably not. Although why we don't believe it is not being questioned here. After all, Chris hasn't justified the view of bourgeois rights in absence of a theological conception of natural law. While Marx does talk about bourgeois rights, he does not talk about natural law in such a way. So again, unsure how this relates to Chris's claim about upholding original Marxism. It said that Marxists do see, and Marx does see, that bourgeois freedoms are limited by the bourgeoisie themselves. You know, this is where the regression Christian thesis comes from, and I believe Chris would point to the AFT Brumaire of Louis Napoleon for where this has its initial instantiation in Marx, as opposed to like maybe Adorno's negative dialectics or something like that. All right, back to the text. Capitalism demands that we surrender our rights to the needs not of society but of capital. Yes. Now this is where Chris's insistence that we have to separate capitalism from bourgeois society, as capitalism is development of it, but not innate to it, is something that I find a little bit weird. I mean, there are other forms of bourgeois society, none of them necessarily like this. French absolutism was a form of bourgeois society, or at least a form of bourgeois society running up against medieval society, not yet being able to overthrow it until they did. But if you read the early Enlightenment philosophers and what they thought about the need for enlightened despotism, it becomes pretty clear that they were pretty much on board. At least Diderot, Voltaire, etc. were. Now, they weren't so much in the English case. Although, again, Locke has his own contradictory notions of rights. But we need to be liable to misrecognize the needs of capitalists, but we are liable to misrecognize the needs of capital of those of society. Yes, we are liable to do that. I would say this is fairly standard Marxist fare. And of course they are. The needs of an alienated society. We think we are serving the needs of society. We are inevitably always serving the needs of capital. We surrender our rights to the needs not of society, but of capital always. Sure. Marx recognizes long ago that socialism is capitalism, and capitalism is socialism. Samsara's nirvana. Yeah. I want to quote on that. See, I've actually pointed out that that this is not consistent with the critique of the Goethe program or my readings of Capital. And that's just an assertion that is made. And this is a problem that I have with platypus affiliated society members, is they often argue by assertion according to Marx, and will just claim to represent the actual real Marxism, often without quoting a goddamn thing. Look at this. Is there a quote? Socialism is not freedom, but an alienated projection, a projection of capitalism. Where on earth does Marx say that? Capitalism is an alienated society and socialism is a product of that alienation. List of assertions: X equals Y, Y equals Z. Because Marx said so, although again, where Marx said it is not given. It is just asserted. Chris, where does he say it? I want chapter and verse. This includes political alienation, which becomes a mystification of the law and the state and their reification and hypostatization. I would actually agree with this. I just, this part. I'm not sure that capitalism in an alienated society and socialism is a projection of that alienation. That's doing a whole lot of fucking work. But the next sentence is true, except for this ties it to the last sentence. So we're going to have to bracket that out. But capitalist society includes political alienation, which becomes a mystification of law and the state, their reification and hypostaticization. Ironically, since the bourgeois revolution had secularized law and the state, except for natural rights, as we talked about, but they did secularize law and the state. They tried to even remove claims of theological law, and it was theological law, from the basis of bourgeois society. The person who didn't was Hobbes. I mean, Hobbes seems to believe in some kind of material God, like a literal material God. But his social contract theory is not rooted in natural law, because the only natural law he thinks exists is tooth and claw versus tooth and claw. So there is one natural law for Hobbes, and that's the law of self-preservation. And all political rights extend from that, i.e. you don't have them. Anyway, which most of the Enlightenment takes Hobbes's initial presumptions, which I think are liberal. Initial human equity, contractarianism, consent, individualized notions of persons, etc., etc. None of these things I think, are particularly true, but I do think they're liberal. And Hobbes takes them to an illiberal conclusion. And a lot of the product of the English Enlightenment is trying to tie in those ideas of the philosophers coming out of France with that coming out of Locke, etc., which try to take what they like about social contract theory and remove the Hobbesian element, of the absolute state. Because for Hobbes, society is maintained by the state, but not for Locke and not for the founding fathers, a lot of the French philosophers, the early revolutionaries in France, etc. All right, but what does this have to do with Marx? Well, Marx does write a lot about the mystification of law and the state as a mystification of power. So, since the bourgeois revolution had secularized law and the state and removed them from the domain of divine justification and religious authority, true, although with the caveat that they still believed that the ultimate rights were rooted in natural law and thus God. And that is also true in Locke. Locke's particular version of social contract theory actually tries to use natural rights as a way to fight back on the implications of Hobbes's assumptions of human equity. Anyway, ironically, since the bourgeois revolution has secularized the law and the state and removed them from the domain of divine justification and religious authority, bringing them within the realm of consciousness of society and history. What is the realm of consciousness of society? What is the consciousness of an aggregate like that? And then put it in history? What is that? I've accused Chris of idealism many times. I don't see how this is not an idealist conception of history. So again, Chris, explain to me. That consciousness has withered. Marx critiques socialism as an alienated misrecognition of the content of freedom. Again, I want chapter and verse citations, not assertions. You're trained as an academic, Cutrone. You know better. Not just on the people you are critiquing, but on the people you are using to justify your critique. As pedagogue, it is your duty. Do it. Which appears as either anarchy or totalitarian statism. That's a fun binary. As pure rationalism or pure rationalism. But as for the Marxist dialectic, it is both and neither. As for this sentence, it has both meaning and no meaning at all. What is pure irrationalism and pure rationalism? Undefined, undelimited. How is that not mere rhetoric or an ideal type? Come on. It will appear in either anarchy or totalitarian statism. And again, even if this is true, these have to be delimited. Their meaning given, particularly in relation to the content of freedom. Marx critiques socialism as the alienated content of freedom. Now, which form of socialism? Etc., etc. Socialism was meant to work through the crisis of bourgeois emancipation and its political form in liberal democracy. Why? In capitalism, not negate it in either libertarianism or totalitarian democracy. Again, ideal typology stated as facts and not rooted in statements by Marx himself. Who said that socialism was meant to be the crisis, to see through the crisis of bourgeois emancipation? Right, Marx? Okay, but where and in what context? Cite your fucking sources. If you uphold the original strain of Marxism, you have to uphold how this is in the text and in the tradition with both historical examples and the context from which they come. You cannot merely assert them. Are you so used to being a pedagogue, to being the teacher that no one pushes back on, that you don't feel that you have to do that? And yes, Chris, I'm addressing you directly. Come on, man. I can't adjudicate this as right or wrong without knowing how you're interpreting Marx as saying this. Otherwise, this is speaking to people who only accept your normative framework. And maybe that's okay for you. That seems to be a way to build a cargo cult, not a political movement. And I would like to believe that building a cargo cult is not your primary goal. Yes, communism emerges out of a critique of socialism in both its blankest and its German national forms, and both its forms in the German historical school and in Lassalleanism in particular. Although Lassalle thought he was Marxist, but nonetheless. But also from things like Fichte and in German idealizations of the state, that was also part of what was being critiqued, as well as the limitations and contradictions in bourgeois society itself. Now, Marx does not say this ends in either libertarianism or totalitarian democracy. Those terms I do not believe are used, as neither were common at the time. But in forms of totality, maybe. Classical liberal thought, we're going to have classical liberal thought presented as a unified unit, is usually associated with the so-called minimal state, but this is misleading. I mean, yeah, true, fair. Want more than this. In the conception of the U.S. constitutional order envisioned by the founders, I mean, which ones? It was a highly contentious debate. That's why the Constitution has weird concessions in it. The American revolutionaries, I mean, that's a nice rhetorical trick there. They should be one and the same, right? The tyranny of the state was not merely contraposed to the freedom of society, but different elements of state power were counterbalanced against each other as opposed to tyrannies. The tyranny of law. Yeah, but I want to point out that Marx, in specific, over and over again, and I can tell you the places, in his critique of anarchism, on political indifferentism is the text. In the Brumaire, even in the letters he wrote to Liebknecht and Bebel, he is very clear, to a point that I think is disturbingly problematic, about the centralization of the state and about the need for the centralization of the state to manage an increasingly centralized capital, and thus creating the ability to eventually get rid of the state as it was not really needed anymore. You know, but actually, ironically, through increasing centralization. This is a fundamentally different theory than theories of separation of powers. There's nowhere does Marx talk about the separation of executive versus judiciary versus legislative power. He talks about the dictatorship of the class. Nonetheless, each was a dictatorship checking and balancing the others: a legislative dictatorship, a judicial dictatorship, and executive dictatorship. That's an interesting bit of rhetoric. Given that dictatorship in Marx refers to this, it refers to the subsumption of government power so to stop a crisis in its classical definition. And that is also the definition generally used by the founders. The idea that they thought they were building three battling dictatorships, given that dictatorship, seems to me a way to, frankly, impose two very opposed paradigms on another and say they're the same. It is a third of these that concerns us here regarding Trump. Trump sounds accused of abusing power and wanting to establish a dictatorship. But against the dictator powers of the law and the state enforcement of it are being mobilized against his candidate for re-election for presidency. In so doing, Trump's opponents are threatening the authority and power of the executive body embodied in the presidency as such. I want to point out that increasingly the idea that Platypus is sympathetic to neoconservatism as understood by the Bush presidency and the idea of like executive powers is not entirely unfair depending on how you read this. Now, I'm not saying that's what Cutrone is arguing. I'm going to let him clarify. But I can see that reading of this statement. All right. However, I actually agree that there is a way in which we see different parts of the state acting against each other But also, I think explicitly here, this is actually dangerous rhetoric. Trump's opponents are threatening an authority of power to the executive embodied in the president as such. The president is an elected monarch and elected dictator. Where in any constitutional order is that said? How is that reconcilable with the notion of the limitations of the executive in the Constitution, particularly given the accusations of tyranny inherent in the Declaration of Independence? See, when people listen to the Bonapartist stuff, you start to see why I accuse Chris and Spencer of being Bonapartist. The president is elected monarch. This is especially so in capitalism, which brings out the necessity of dictatorial message, especially prominently. Ah, yes, the old on authority thesis. Except that's only according to Engels supposed to apply to production. This is special, turning from its rare occasion of emergency into normal exercise in managing the roles of crisis of capital. Marx called this Bonapartism of the capitalist state, a distinct from its earlier pre-revolution, industrial revolution bourgeois form. You will notice this insistence on the Industrial Revolution as the distinctor for platypus, particularly because Chris emphasizes it. It's based off of a reading, I think, in the Communist Catechism and in the Manifesto of industrial relations being what accelerated the problems here in capitalism, because it accelerated the contradictions too quickly. I don't think that's conducive to the reading of Das Kapital at all. And if I had to blame my suspicion, I remember that Chris and Spencer told me the reason why they don't read Das Kapital much in the Platypus reading group is that it overfocuses on economics and leads to kind of economism. But I also think it may not be copacetic with this reading of the early Marx. This is seen in a rise of permanent police force in prison, both of which are inventions in the industrial area to control the proletariat. I mean, this is true enough. Permanent police forces in prisons emerge actually in the occupation of Ireland first, and then emerge to control the proletariat more generally. But nonetheless, fair enough. From the subsequent progressive era, we get a fourth branch of government, namely a permanent bureaucracy of the administrative state. Yes, we do. That's fair. It is the dictatorship of the deep state that has conflicted with the elected presidency. This has raised the issue of civilian government per se. Trump represents elected civilian authority over the state where they clash. I mean, in addition to taking... I don't see how this is... We'll come back to this. Trump claims prosecutorial immunity from criminal prosecution, the Lockean executive prerogative to break the law in order to preserve it. I mean, we're Marxists, not Lockeans, but if capitalism is socialism, then Marxism is liberalism, and these distinctions don't have a purpose. That is how you logically deduce X equals Y. But that isn't dialectical, Derek. Neither are any of these statements. There's already in a legislative, parliamentary, and judicial immunity to prevent the abuse of the executive law by the executive, which was in Locke's moment, was that of hereditary monarchy and its appointed magistrates deputy, including judges. What is usually overlooked is the need to prevent the reverse, the legislative and judicial abuse of the executive function of the government. This is indeed a deep state of permanent bureaucratic special bodies of armed men and the state of capitalism, which sought to escape political responsibility to civilian authority in the elected office in the presidency. Trump was targeted by the deep state as well as his political adversaries, Democrats and Republicans, from the beginning of his candidacy. Well, I mean, in so much that there is a unified deep state of which you can target, that seems fair enough. He did tick off the administrative state, and we can see that in the fact that Biden has continued a lot of Trump policies, which may be necessary for whatever stage of capital, like, I don't know how that's not economism, but whatever. But at least some elements of the deep state, some elements of the administrative apparatus actually were in favor of Trump. Usually around Department of Homeland Security. But yes, he's right that we can see that by the fact that a lot of Trump era policies were maintained, but maintained with collusion of the administrative state themselves, we can definitely see that what was at issue for a lot of people was not Trump's actual substantive policies, at least for a lot of his opponents in government, but the way he went about them. All right, and now we get to the unitary executive theory. The unitary executive theory raised in response to Nixon-era reforms curtailing presidential authority and powers, both legally and politically correct. That without untrammeled executive power, there is tyranny. Thank you, Rebel and Michelle's. Also, this is neoconservatism. It should be called out for what it is. Without untrammeled executive power, there is tyranny. Without the tyranny of Bonaparte, we will have the tyranny of the legislator. This is what Marxism is reduced to. And again, without a single fucking citation from Marx. Not one. Or Engels, or anybody. These are assertions. That so many people allowed this to go unquestioned, or people just run away and denounce Cutrone for things he does not say, means that getting further elaboration on this remains impossible. The bureaucratic administrative changes made after Watergate, establishing the independence of federal law enforcement from the presidency at the dawn of the neoliberal era, were long in the making, and are blind or indifferent to the fatal compromise of politics involved in it. I agree with that. Nixon was ousted by the CIA and the FBI, as they are now trying to do with Trump. It is not surprising that along with Trump and the crisis of electoral parties manifesting at the end of neoliberalism, the problematic rationale for these post-Nixon changes is surfacing again now. Nixon said that he thought that if the president did it, it wasn't illegal. He might have been right about that. He resigned to avoid impeachment, which is more importantly a political and not a legal process conducted by elected politicians, not career prosecutors and law enforcement officers. These post-Watergate reforms removed the deep state in the executive branch of the federal government from elected civilian political authority. I both agree with that and do not necessarily sign on to if the president did it, it wasn't illegal, given the fucking context of the Declaration of Independence itself. Although perhaps tyranny has nothing to do with law. Although remember, it was the substance of British common law and the rights of British citizens, which were elements of natural law that made the whole thing justifiable in the first place by the founders. That was the basis for the revolution. This is just saying, through a use of ideal types, that somehow Marx would sign on to neoconservative theories of the executive because of the threat of unelected administrative state officials. Even though the unelected administrative state officials are often acting under legislative mandate. But I agree, there's a fundamental contradiction in how much of the democratic apparatus liberals want to put in the administrative state, which is professionalized. I totally agree. That's a problem. That's a class problem even. So I'm going to give Cutrone the analysis of the problem while pointing out that I think his solution is straight up Valorization of Bonapartism. Has more to do with Hegel than with Marx. Trump maintains the decision of his case will affect not only his own fate, but that of the U.S. presidency as such. This is simply true. Actually agreed. Should the president become a mere figurehead for the permanent deep state? Are presidential initiatives merely suggestions to the bureaucracy? The thing is, the deep state is part of the bureaucracy itself. Yes, but also the executive is part of the bureaucracy. That's what the executive does, is enact legislative mandates, which is part of the bureaucracy. And I agree that there is an unintended side effect in limiting the presidency from the 20th century's increasing Bonapartist and bureaucratic apparatuses, thus liberating the bureaucracy from the presidency, except for the ability of the president to dismiss their leadership. That's a problem. I agree it's a problem. It's a contradiction in two separate liberal impulses. So don't think I don't see this dialectically, but I do not see the dictatorship of the executive, which is, again, I suspect Cutrone is using this to claim that the United States is a dictatorship of the proletariat. Would he be so bold as to admit that directly? Are presidential initiatives merely suggestions to the bureaucracy? Congress has set up an unelected bureaucratic executive whose agency's decisions have the force of law. All right, Congress has set that up, which is the legislature, which you remember the legislature creates the law. The executive enforces it. That is its prerogative. That the executive means to execute. If there is a dictatorship of the executive, it is within one field of government. Congress has set up executives, but is it the presidential election merely a rallying point for a down ballot candidates to Congress? Is there only to be legislation and lawfare in the courts and no longer an executive prerogative by electoral mandate? The presidency is only an office chosen by the entire electorate, however mediated by the federal state system. Still, the president is the only nationally elected politician. Senators are, yeah, that's true. This is what makes him dangerous. Trump is wrongly accused, not because he didn't do what they say, but because his persecution is wrongly motivated. I mean, that's an interesting bit of rhetoric. Wrongly accused. This is an equivocation of the word wrong. I don't think platypoids are used to parsing rhetoric because they let a lot of shit slide. Wrongly here can mean what Chris is saying it, but wrongly accused generally does not mean that. It means wrongly accused as in not guilty, not wrongly accused as in intended to abrogate legal democracy in a pointed way by violating the personal rights of an individual and denying the collective political rights of democracy. Well, I agree that in so much of these things seem politically motivated, it does seem to belie a fear of democracy. And also a fear in the decline of other forms of powers. Marx declared that the goal of communism is the situation where the freedom of each is the precondition of the freedom of all. Okay. So we have a citation here. And so we know that the citation is that the freedom of each is a precondition of freedom of all. Very standard Marxist sentiment. Let's go and talk about where it comes from. So I'm going to change the screen here for us and get into the manifesto where this phrase appears. It also appears, I think, in the German ideology. It's fairly consistent in Marx's corpus. So now, unlike some of the other stuff I've said, we have a quote. But I'm going to bring up, before we get into that, how Chris interprets this. There is no utopian goal but an existing value, so an abstraction, already in bourgeois society, however violated by capitalism. So we have this again, and I don't remember this in Chris's early thinking. I was going to ask him when he separates bourgeois society from capitalism because platypodes insist on it now. They didn't when I was first talking about it. So let us pull up the text at hand. And we're also going to pull up the little bit of writing Marx did on the separation of powers, which is in the Brumaire, and talk about how consistent that is with what Chris is presenting here. So for those of you who know your Marxism and your Marx, you know that what Chris is invoking in that line is the last line of the second chapter of the Communist Manifesto. So let's just pull it up. We're going to read the whole thing. Chapter 2, Proletarians and Communists. In what relations do communists stand to the proletarians as a whole? The communists do not form a separate party opposed to other working class parties. They have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. They do not set up any sectarian principles of their own, by which they would shape and mold the proletarian movement. Ouch, ouch. This hurts a lot of current left practices. Gonna say that right there. The communists are distinguished from other working class parties by only this. One, in national struggles of the proletariat of different countries, they point out and bring to the front the common interest of the entire proletariat, independent of all nationality. Two, in the various stages of development, which struggles with the working class against the bourgeoisie has passed through, they are always and everywhere represent the interest of the movement as a whole. Cough, 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 cough. The communists, therefore, on one hand, practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country, that section which pushes forward all others. On the other hand, theoretically, they have over the great masses of the proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the line of Marx, the conditions, and the general results of proletarian movement. The immediate aim of the communists is the same as of all other proletarian parties: the formation of the proletariat into class, the overthrow of the bourgeois supremacy, and the conquest of political power by the proletariat. The theoretical conclusions of the communists are in no way based on ideas or principles that have been invented or discovered by this or that would-be universal reformer. That's a little bit of an issue of focusing all on bourgeois values, but we'll come back to that. They merely express, in general terms, actual relations springing from the existing class struggle, from the historical movement going on under our very eyes. The abolition of existing property relations is not at all a distinctive feature of communism. All property relations in the past have continually been subject to historical change, consequent upon the change in historical conditions. The French Revolution, for example, abolished feudal property in favor of bourgeois property. The distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property. This is also missed, but this is not relevant to our discussion here. But the modern bourgeois private property is the final and most complete expression of the system of producing and appropriating products based on class antagonism, on the exploitation of the many by the few. In that sense, the theory of communists may be summed up in a single sentence: the abolition of private property. We communists have been reproached with the desire for abolishing the right of personally acquiring property as a fruit of man's own labor, which is property allegedly to be the groundwork of all personal freedom, activity, and independence. Hard-won, self-acquired, self-earned property. But do you mean the property of the petty artisan or the small peasant, a form of property that preceded the bourgeois form? There's no need to abolish that. The development of industry has a great extent already destroyed that and is still destroying it daily. So we're not defending the property of the petty artisan on a small peasant because we don't need to. What do you mean modern bourgeois private property? Does not wage labor create any property for the laborer? Not a bit. It creates capital, i.e., a kind of property which exploits wage labor and which cannot increase except upon the condition of beginning a new supply of wage labor for fresh exploitation. Property in its present form is based on the antagonism of capital and wage labor. Let us examine both sides of this antagonism. To be a capitalist is to have not only personal property, but a social status in production. Capital is a collective product, and only by united action of many members, nay, in the last resort, only by united action of all members of society can it be set in motion. Capital is therefore not only personal, it is social power. When, therefore, capital is converted into common property, into the property of all members of society, personal property is not therefore transferred into social property, or transformed into social property. It only the social character of the property that is changed. It loses its class character. Now let us take wage labor. The average price of wage labor is the minimum wage, i.e. the quantum of the means of subsistence by which absolute requisite to keep the laborer in bare existence as a laborer. What, therefore, is the wage laborer appropriates by the means of his labor merely suffices to prolong and reproduce the bare existence. We by no means intend to abolish this personal appropriation of products of labor, an appropriation which is made for the maintenance and reproduction of human life, and that leaves no surplus within it to command the labor of others. All we want to do away with is what is miserable character of this appropriation, under which the laborer lives merely to increase capital and is allowed to live only insofar as the interest of the ruling class requires it. In bourgeois society, I want to point this out because remember, Chris has said there's a distinction between bourgeois society and capitalism. In bourgeois society, living labor is but a means to increase accumulated labor. In communist society, notice communist society is set up in contradistinction to bourgeois society. Accumulated labor is but a means to widen, to enrich, and promote the existence of the laborer. In bourgeois society, therefore, the past dominates the present. In communist society, the present dominates the past. Notice again, these are deliberately pointed out in contradistinction to each other. Something that Chris downplays. In fact, Chris plays the division is not the division between communist and bourgeois society, but division between bourgeois and capitalist form of bourgeois society. A distinction that, while seemingly in here, is a little bit harder to reconcile. After all, capitalism as a word is actually not used super a lot in Marx. It is used, but not a ton. In bourgeois society, capital is independent and has individuality, while a living person is dependent and has no individuality. Hardly a validation of bourgeois society that Chris presents communism as being the extension of. And the abolition of the state of things is called by the bourgeois the abolition of individuality and freedom, and rightly so. The abolition of bourgeois individuality, bourgeois independence, and bourgeois freedom is undoubtedly aimed at. How in the world can you take this text and make the claim that Chris makes? I'm going to read it for you again. This is no utopian goal, but an existing value already in bourgeois society, however violated by capitalism. This is what the manifesto, the text that he's quoting, says. And again, remember, he sees himself as representing original Marxism. By freedom is meant under the present bourgeois conditions of production, free trade, free selling and buying. But if selling and buying disappears, free selling and buying disappears also. This talk about free selling and buying and all other brave words are bourgeois about freedom in general have meaning if only in contrast with the restricted selling and buying with the fettered traders of the Middle Ages, but have no meaning when opposed to the communistic abolition of buying and selling and bourgeois conditions of production and of the bourgeoisie itself. You are horrified by our intending to do away with private property, but your existing society, private property is already done away with for 9/10 of the population. Its existence for the few is solely due to the non-existence in the hands of the 9/10. You reproach us, therefore, for intending to do away with a form of property, the necessary condition for whose existence is the non-existence of any property of the immense majority of society. Notice here that he is not saying that this is just capitalism doing this. This is bourgeois society. Bourgeois society itself is a limit on its own ability to recognize its freedoms because it's based on the freedoms being limited. In other words, you reproach us for intending to do away with property. Precisely, this is just what we intend. From the moment when the laborer can no longer be converted into capital, money, or rent, into social power capable of being monopolized, i.e., from the moment the individual property can no longer be transformed into bourgeois property into capital, bourgeois property is capital. From that moment, you say individuality vanishes. You therefore confess that by the individual, you mean no other person than the bourgeois, than the middle-class owner of property. This person must indeed be swept out of the way and made impossible. Communism deprives no man of the power to appropriate the products of society. All it does is to deprive him of the power to subjugate the labor of others by the means of such appropriation. It has been objected that upon the abolition of private property, all work will cease and all universal laziness will overtake us. According to this, bourgeois society ought to long ago have gone to the dogs through sheer idleness. For those of its members who work acquire nothing, and those who acquire anything do not work. The whole objection is but another expression of a tautology. There can be no longer any wage labor when there is no longer any capital. All objections urged against the communistic mode of producing and appropriating material products have, in the same sense, been urged against the communistic mode of producing and appropriating intellectual products. Just as to the bourgeoisie, the disappearance of class property is a disappearance of production itself, so the disappearance of class culture is identical with the disappearance of all culture. That culture is the loss which he laments is for an enormous majority a mere chaining to act as a machine. But don't wrangle with us so long as you apply in our intended abolition of bourgeois policy the standard of your bourgeois notions of freedom, culture, etc. Your very ideas are but the outgrowth of the conditions of bourgeois production and bourgeois property, just as your jurisprudence is but the will of your class made into a law for all. This has implications for Chris's argument that I think he is not stating. A will which its essential character and direction are determined by the economic conditions of the existence of your class. This selfish misconception that induces you to transform into eternal laws of nature and of reason, cough, cough, the social forms springing from your present mode of production and form of property, historical relations rise and disappear in the progress of production. This misconception you share with every ruling class that has preceded you. What you see clearly in the case of agent property, what you admit in the case of feudal property, you are of course forbidden to admit in the case of your own bourgeois form of property. Abolition, Aufhebung, of the family, even the most radical flare-up, infamous proposal of the communists. On what foundation is the present family, the bourgeois family, based? On capital, on private gain. It is completely developed form. This family exists only amongst the bourgeoisie, but in the state of things finds its complement in the practical absence of the family amongst the proletarian and in public prostitution. The bourgeois family will vanish as a matter of course when its complement vanishes, and both will vanish with the vanishing of capital. Do you charge us with wanting to stop the exploitation of children by their parents? This is a crime that we plead guilty. But also, this is aimed at Ashley Frawley. Do you charge us with wanting us to stop the exploitation of children by their parents? This is a crime to which we plead guilty? Sorry, Ashley. Separate case. Do you want to charge us with stopping the exploitation of children by their parents? This is a crime we plead guilty. But you say we destroy the most hollowed of relations. We replace it with home education by social. And your education, is it not also social and also determined by social conditions under which you educate? By the intervention, direct or indirect, of society by means of schools, etc. The communists have not invented the intervention of society in education. They do not seek but to alter the character of that intervention, not to rescue education from the influence of the ruling class. And to rescue the education, that's not a not there, and to rescue the education for the influence of the ruling class. This bourgeois claptrap about the family and education, about hollow correlations of parent and child, becomes all the more disgusting the more, by the action of the modern industry, all the family ties among the proletarian are turned asunder, and their children are transformed into simple articles of commerce and instruments of labor. But you communists would introduce the community of women, screams the bourgeoisie in chorus. The bourgeoisie sees a wife as a mere instrument of production. He hears that instrument of production are the exploited in common, and naturally can come to no other conclusion that the lot of being common to all will likewise fall to women, because he views women as property. To replicate that, he has not even the suspicion about the real point aimed at to do away with the status of women are mere instruments of production. For the rest, nothing is more ridiculous than the virtuous indignation of the bourgeoisie of the of the community of women, which they pretend is openly and officially established by the communists. The communists have no need to introduce the community of women. It has existed from time immemorial. Our bourgeois, not content with having wives and daughters of their proletariat at their disposal, not to speak of common prostitutes, take the greatest pleasure in seducing each other's wives. Bourgeois marriage is in reality a system of wives in common, and thus at most what communists might possibly be reproached for is what they desire to introduce in substitution for a hypocritically concealed and openly legalized community of women. For the rest, it is self-evident the abolition of the present system of production must bring with the abolition of the community of women springing from that system, i.e. of prostitution, both public and private. The communists are further reproached for desiring to abolish countries and nationality. The working men have no country. We cannot take from them what they have not got. I think this is all very clear, and most communists today ignore most of this. But it's also not completely copacetic with what Cliss is claiming, that this already exists in bourgeois society. Since the proletariat must first acquire all political supremacy, must rise to be the leading class of the nations, must constitute itself the nation, and so far itself national, though not in the bourgeois sense of the word. National differences and antagonisms between people are daily more and more vanishing, owing to the development of the bourgeoisie, to the freedom of commerce, to the world market, to the uniformity in the mode of production, and the conditions of life corresponding thereto, aka globalism, what conservatives no longer like. The supremacy of the proletariat will cause this to vanish faster. United action of the leading civilized countries, at least, is one of the first conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat. And on this, Cutrone is accurate. That is what Marx predicts. United action of the leading civilized countries, at least, not from the periphery. In the proportion to the exploitation of the individual by another will also put an end to the exploitation of one nation by another, but will also be put to an end. In the proportion as the antagonism between classes within nations vanish, the hostility of one nation to another will also come to an end. The charges against communism made from a religious, philosophical, and generally from an ideological standpoint are not deserving of a serious examination. Does it require deep intuition to comprehend that man's ideas, views, and conceptions in one word, man's consciousness, changes with each change in the conditions of his material existence, in his social relations, and in his life? What else does history of ideas prove? Then that the intellectual production changes its character in proportion to the material production is changed. The ruling of ideas of each age has never been the ideas the ruling ideas of each age has ever been, not never, the ideas of the ruling class. When people speak of ideas that revolutionize society, they do but express the fact that within the old society, elements of the new one have been created. All right. So if one takes this to mean that bourgeois society is capitalism, is socialism, as Chris is claiming, and not socialism is an inherent trait in capitalism preemptively that is waiting to be left out, then these are very different statements. For if to say that X is Y because Y already exists as a subcondition of X, then one can say that not only is capitalism and communism the same, but communism and feudalism are the same, since the same logic would apply between feudalism and capitalism, and the transitive property would thus apply there too. Now, this is undialectical, but this is basically the way the argument rhetorically was made. All right. And that the dissolution of the old ideas keeps even pace with the dissolution of the old conditions of existence. When in the ancient world was in the last throes, the ancient religions overcome by Christianity, when Christian ideas succumbed in the 18th century to rationalist ideas, feudal society fought its death battle with the revolutionary bourgeoisie, the idea of religious liberty and the freedom of conscience merely gave expression to the sway of free competition within the domains of knowledge. Undoubtedly, it will be said, religious, moral, philosophical, and juridical ideas have been modified in the course of historical development, but religion, morality, philosophy, political science, and law constantly survive this change. This is in quotation, by the way. There is, besides eternal truths such as freedom, justice, etc., that are common to all societies. This is quoted here as to be pointed out as wrong. But communism abolishes eternal truths. It abolishes all religion and all morality instead of constituting them on a new basis, and therefore acts in contradiction to all past historical experiences. This is a quote. But what does this accusation reduce itself to? The history of all past society has consisted in development of class antagonisms. Antagonisms assumed from different forms of different epochs. But whatever they may have taken, one fact is common to all ages, viz. The exploitation of one part of society by another. No wonder, then, that the social consciousness of the past ages, despite all the multiplicity and variety it displays, moves within certain common forms or general ideas which cannot be completely vanished except through the total disappearance of class antagonism. The communist revolution is the most radical rupture with traditional property relations. No wonder its development involved the most radical rupture with traditional ideas. Again, so let us be done with bourgeois objections to communism. As we have seen above, the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class to win the battle of democracy. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest, by all degrees, all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments in the hands of production in the hands of the state, i.e. the proletariat organized as a ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property and on the conditions of bourgeois production, and by the means of measures, therefore, which appear economically insufficient and untenable, by which, in course of that movement, outstrip themselves, necessitate further inroads upon the old social order, and are unavoidable as means of entirely revolutionizing the mode of production. These measures will, of course, be different in different countries. Nevertheless, in the most advanced countries, the following will be pretty generally applicable: the abolition of property in land and the abolition of all rents of land to public purposes. A heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Marx very vacillates on this later in the Brumaire, but nonetheless. The abolition of all rights of inheritance, confiscation of property of all immigrants and rebels, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with the state capital and with an exclusive monopoly, centralization of the communication and transports in the hands of the state, the extension of factories and implements of production owned by the state to be burned on the conservation of wastelands and improvement of the soil generally in accordance with the common plan, equal liability of all to work, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture, combination of agricultural and manufacturing industries, the gradual abolition of all distinction between town and country by means of more equitable distribution of the populace over the country, free education for our children in public schools, abolition of children's factory labor in its present form. This is modified labor by what in the critique of the Goethe program by some acceptable forms of child labor in terms of education, but they're very limited. That's in a later document. It's not in this one. Combination of education with the industrial production, etc., etc. And in the course of development, class distinctions have disappeared. All production has been concentrated in the hands of the vast majority of the association of the whole nation. The public power will lose its political character. Political power, properly so called, is merely an organized power of one class for oppressing another. If the proletariat, during its contest with the bourgeoisie, is compelled by force of circumstances to organize itself as a class by means of revolution, and it makes itself a ruling class, and as such sweeps away by force all old conditions of production, then it will, along with these conditions, have swept away the conditions of existence of class antagonism and of classes generally, and will therefore have abolished its own supremacy as a class, because everyone will be in it. That's me talking about that. In the place of a bourgeois society with classes and class antagonisms, we have an association in which a free development of each is a precondition for the free development of all. Now, how is that related to what Quirce is claiming? And some of it might be, but I don't think in the simple way he presents here. Let's go back to the claims made in the article. Marx declared that the goal of communism to be the situation where the freedom of each is a precondition of the freedom of all. Yes, he did. This is no longer a utopian goal, but an existing value already in bourgeois society. How in the hell can you read what I just read and say that this is an existing value in bourgeois society? However violated by capitalism. He doesn't say that capitalism violates it. He says the needs of capital, a product of bourgeois society, violates it. The focus on the Industrial Revolution, which is brought up in the Communist Catechism by Engels, is not in later works, but it's still to be aspired as a task of getting beyond it. It is a principle to be observed in practice, so that its compromise can be recognized as a problem here and now, not to be accepted in its apparent but false necessity in capitalism. Socialism was to realize this. All right, so the second part of this I think is true. If the principle is to be observed in practice so the compromise could be recognized as a problem in the here and now, not to be accepted in the parent, but falsely necessary in capitalism. Socialism wants to realize this. But socialism is a negation of bourgeois society itself, because bourgeois society is a class society. But the pseudo-left has long fallen into the antinomy of individualism versus collectivism and capitalist contradiction, and has taken the later value as its own, abandoning personal liberty to the avowed right. I agree with this, actually, as a critique of the left. I don't know how one decides what is pseudo here. However, conservative collectivism belongs to the right, demanding the sacrifice of the individual. We should not agree to this demand, and certainly not in the name of social justice. Agreed. I don't know what justice has to do with any of this, and I don't know how this goes above. But the fact that Trump appears to be politically as both the private person only selfishly motivated and the public menace, unleashing the demons of popular fury, is indicative of the contradiction that liberal democracy defense presents in capitalism. No, I think it's a contradiction in liberal democracy, period. Thus, the tendency towards both Caesarism and Bonapartism, which this seemingly kind of defends. Well, we'll get back to that. He thus perfectly embodies the issue. That he is an unremarkably moderate conservative centrist in his policies that has to be defined to be meaningful. And politics only emphasizes the fact Citizen Trump is the problem. Well, the Trump derangement syndrome is a problem. I mean, I've never disagreed with this. It's been a justification for a popular frontists to tie people back into the existing elements of the state. But nonetheless, a lot of this argument to me does not flow, despite me agreeing with this part of it. The threat of fascism, the specter of ancient democracy and of tribal republicanism, has haunted the capitalist world from its inception of its crisis. After long crying wolf at Trump, finally on January 6, 2001, Trump seemed to confirm the worst fears by summoning a mob to riot at the Capitol to delay or prevent the certification of electoral defeat, to, quote, stop the steal. Perhaps, as Nixon said in 1960, they stole it fair and square. So there's no point in challenging it. But the man was right to speak, however demagogically, and the people have a right to protest against their government and its public buildings, whose physical structures and political prejudices, after all, belong to them, and no one but them, they belong to us. Well, I mean, this is assuming that the state actually functions the way that it is ideally designed to. And I guess, to some degree, fair enough. That's never been true, though. And in fact, one of the first things passed is, the Insurrection Act. These are old acts. Trump's election was protested by Democrats, so why are they protesting Biden's election? Why is protesting Biden's election forbidden? I mean, it's not. People do it. Although it shouldn't be forbidden, but it should be pointed out that many claims made about it have no evidence. The Democrats and established Republicans sought to delegitimize Trump's election, and Trump has returned the favor. Yes, this is a problem. This is a problem of the breakdown of liberal democratic norms. And why have they broken down? I would like to hear more than what's presented here, but I think this is true. Evidently, his most prized classification documents were that showed his innocence of the Russian collusion hoax manufactured against him by the Democrats and the deep state. Now, again, deep state is capitalized and presented as a unitary actor, which is, kind of intellectually dishonest, but whatever. A lot of these things about Russian collusion was manufactured by the Democrats. Not that there weren't elements of Russiagate that was true, but the overarching narrative was totally false. And stuff like the Steele dossier were totally made up. So in that sense, I am sympathetic that was shenanigans. But again, seeing the government, even the deep state, that unilaterally is a bit problematic and seems to be picking up right-wing dog whistles. But again, Chris challenged me. Why don't I accept his belief that he's representing original Marxism? And I'm going to read why, because we're going to end this with a discussion of the Brumaire, where it's the only time I can find Marx talking about separation of powers and constitutions. And I think it's interesting that it's not cited directly in here. As I wrote more than 8 years ago, when Trump first appeared on the political stage, the crisis of neoliberalism have been a crisis of its politics, and this takes the form of the crisis of liberal democracy, specifically of its political parties. All the anxious talk about populism betrays this fact. I think it's true, but it actually postdates a crisis in neoliberal economics, which again, I don't think is focused enough on by platypus people, because they tend to be political first. Probably because, frankly, this betrays whiffs of idealism. In ancient Rome, every election was attended by a gang warfare and blood in the streets spilled by the competing factions. Candidates were assassinated, elections rigged by elections triggered civil wars, as in capitalism. Every election was a political revolution, and this is still the case, and it shows. I mean, it really hasn't been the case in a long time, but that's because of some of the things you're complaining about. The bug is the feature, the glitch is in the algorithm, the noise is the music of democracy. It is a Gemeinkraftwerk, but not necessarily the Konterdammerung, especially in the U.S., where the continuation of the original American Revolution. Vivek Ramaswamy called for reinvigorating the spirit of 1776. He sees that in Trump. And this is what I was saying about taking right-wingers at their face, but left-wingers never at their face. Huh. How does Chris protest me saying that? I have never signed on to the conspiracy theories about Trump. I have never said that the liberal prosecutions of him made a whole lot of sense. I have even said that fears about January 6th seem to be overextended. So you can't accuse me of just being a Democrat here, which is what has been done by platypus in the past. I think this idea that I'm secretly a Democrat will be thrown at me for this. But I pointed out that Chris is going to have to explain to me how he got that exegesis from what I just read from the manifesto. And we're going to come back to the Brumaire too. Because Marx doesn't seem to share, at least in what we're reading here, and the rhetorical structure set up and the rhetoric set up, this idea that communism is just a fulfillment of bourgeois society. Bourgeois society can't be fulfilled. It is inherently contradictory. The answers proposed by Trump traumatized opponents is to suspend rights and avoid election, to cancel liberalism and democracy, to ban the opera and the imprisonment's diva. This is no exaggeration. They have done and will do this everything they possibly can to try to prevent Trump's election and taking office. And if they really want to do that, would have assassinated him. They have not done that. In the most remarkable series of events in the history of the U.S., neither Trump nor his supporters nor his opponents are wrong in saying that the fate of American democracy is on the line. The only question is what this says and what it means. And are we afraid to learn? We have yet to figure it out. Trump and Trumpism are not going away. Whatever we might wish, the task of politics remains, and perhaps especially in the crisis of capitalist politics. It points the way to socialist politics from the very heart of liberal democracy in crisis. Without political party for socialism, this is the very best politics capitalism has to offer. Are we afraid of it? I mean, for all my disagreement with this line of argumentation and the fact that I think he gives way too many neoconservative talking points validity based off of trying seemingly to equate the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie with the dictatorship of the capital, I'd agree with this last question. So I repeat the question for the third time now, why not Trump again? And again, I don't think communists should care all the time about who is running the executive office. And nor should we mistake the administrative state as our friend, as is often done. And in that basic sense, I see some of Chris's points. But the rest of his construction, I don't see. That bourgeois society, is the basis of communism, clearly. You don't get it from the manifesto, at least not the part that I read. And I've read all of this many times. Let's go into the Brumaire, where Marx actually talks about constitutionality, about one of the only places where I find that he does. So you cannot say that I don't talk about the sources. I don't merely assert most of the time. Okay, let's get into this. This is from section 2, and we're going to read most of it. Let us pick up the threads of the development once more. The history of the constituent national assembly since June days is a history of the domination and disintegration of the Republican faction of the bourgeoisie, of the faction known by the names of the tricolor Republicans, pure Republicans, political Republicans, foremost Republicans, etc. Under the bourgeois monarchy of Louis Philippe, it had formed the official Republican opposition, and consequently, it recognized the component part of the political world of its day. It had representatives in the chambers and a considerable sphere of influence in the press. Its Paris organ, the National, was considered just as respectable in its way as the Journal des Debates. Its character corresponded to its position under the constitutional monarchy. It was not a faction of the bourgeoisie held together by very common interests and marked off by specific conditions of production. It was just a clique of Republican-minded bourgeois, writers, lawyers, officers, and officials that owned its influence to the personal antipathies of the country to Louis Philippe, to the memories of the old republic, to the Republican faith of the number of enthusiasts, and above all, to French nationalism, whose hatred of the Vienna treaties and of the alliance with England it stirred up perpetually. A large part of the following National under Louis Philippe was due to its concealed imperialism, which could only consequently confront later under the Republic as a deadly rival in the person of Louis Bonaparte. It fought the aristocracy of finance as it did all the rest of the bourgeois opposition. Polemics against the budget, which in France were closely connected with fighting the aristocracy of finance, procured popularity too cheaply and material for puritanical leanings, articles too plentifully to not be exploited. The industrial bourgeoisie was grateful for its slavish defense of French protectionist system, which it adopted, however, Republican instead of monarchist form of bourgeois rule, and above all, the lion's share of the rule. I want to point out that Marx, unlike Cutrone, mentions class preeminently. Cutrone mentions it a few times, and mostly in favor of the bourgeoisie. But let's continue. About the conditions of this transformation, by no means clear in its own mind. On one hand, this was a clear daylight to it, and it was publicly acknowledged that the reform banquets in the last days of Louis Philippe was its unpopularity with the democratic petit bourgeois, and in particular with the revolutionary proletariat. This pure republicanism, as was indeed the way with pure republicans, was always at the point of contending itself at the first infancy with the regency of the Duchess of Orleans. With the February Revolution broke out and assigned their best-known representatives in place of provisional government. From the start, they naturally had the confidence of the bourgeoisie and a majority of the constituent National Assembly. The socialist elements of the provisional government were excluded forthwith from the Executive Commission, with the National Assembly formed when it met, and the party of the National took advantage of the outbreak of the June insurrection to discharge the Executive Commission. Also, they were then to get rid of its closest rivals, the petite bourgeoisie, or democratic Republicans, Landreau Roland, Cavaignac, and the general bourgeois Republican part who commended the June massacre, took the place of the executive with the sort of dictatorial power. Maurras, the former editor-in-chief of the National, became a perpetual president of the Constituent National Assembly, and the ministries, as well known as other important posts, fell to the proportion of pure Republicans. The Republican bourgeois faction, which long regarded itself as the legitimate heir of July monarchy, thus founded its fondest hopes succeeded. It attained power, however, not dreamed of under Louis Philippe, through the liberal revolt of the bourgeoisie against the throne, but through the rising of the proletariat against capital, rising low with grape shot. When it had conceived as the most revolutionary, it even turned out in reality to be the most counter-revolutionary. The fruit held to its lap, and it fell from the tree of knowledge, not from the tree of life. The exclusive rule of the bourgeois Republicans lasted only from June 24th to December 10th, 1848, and it summed up in the drafting of the Republican Constitution and the state of siege of Paris. The new Constitution was at bottom only Republicanized edition of the Constitutional Charter of 1830. The narrow electoral qualifications of the July monarchy, which excluded even a large part of the bourgeoisie from political rule, was incompatible with the existence of the bourgeois republic. In lieu of this qualification, the February Revolution had once proclaimed direct universal suffrage. The bourgeois Republicans could not undo this event. They had to content themselves with adding the limited proviso of the 6 months residence in the constituency. The old organization of administration, the municipal system, the judicial system, the army continued to exist invalid, or where Constitution changed them. The change concerned the table of contents, not the contents, the name, not the subject matter. The inevitable general staff of liberties of 1848, personal liberty, liberty of press, of speech, of association, of assembly, of education, religion, etc., received a constitutional uniform which made them invulnerable. From each of these liberties proclaimed it as an absolute right of the French citoyen, but was also a marginal note that it was unlimited so far as not limited by the equal right of others in public safety, or by laws which are intended to mediate the just harmony of individuals with one another in public safety. For example, the citizens have the right of association, of peaceful and unarmed assembly, of petition and expressing their opinion, whether in the press or in any other way. The enjoyment of these rights have no limit, save the equal right of others and on public safety. We see this today. Education is free. Freedom of education shall be enjoyed on the conditions fixed by law and under the supreme control of the state. The home of every citizen is inviolable except when performed prescribed by law. The Constitution, therefore, constantly refers to organic laws which are to be put into effect upon those marginal notes and regulate the enjoyments of unrestricted liberties in such manner that they will collide neither with each other nor with the public safety. And latter, these organic laws were brought into being by the friends of order, and all those liberties regulated in such a manner that the bourgeoisie in its enjoyment of them finds itself unhindered by the equal rights of other classes. Whether it forbids these liberties entirely to others or permits the enjoyment of them under conditions that are just so many police traps, it always happens solely in interest of public safety, that is, in the safety of the bourgeoisie, as the Constitution prescribes. In its sequel, though both sides accordingly appealed to the justification to the Constitution, the Friends of Order, who abrogated all these liberties, as well as the Democrats, who demanded all of them. For each paragraph of the Constitution contains its own antithesis, its own upper and lower house, namely liberty in general phase and abrogation of liberty in the marginal note. Thus, so as the name of freedom was respected only in its actual realization prevented, of course in a legal way, the constitutional existence of liberty remained intact and violate, however mortal the blows dealt to its existence in actual life. Now, some of this is reconcilable with what Chris says, and some of it is not. We see here that law and freedom are in constant tension, and Chris points that out, I think, correctly. The Constitution, made inviolable in so ingenious a manner, nevertheless, like Achilles, was vulnerable to one point, not at the heel, but at the head, or rather the two heads it round up with, the legislative assembly on one hand and the president on the other. Marx is not a respecter of the differences in houses. This is a problem for him. I mean, and Chris seems to think that Marx was, or at least doesn't talk about Marx's opinion on it one way or the other. Glance through the Constitution and you will find only paragraphs in which the relationship of the president to the legislative assembly is defined in absolute, positive, non-contradictory, and cannot be distorted. For here it is a question of bourgeois Republicans safeguarding themselves. Articles 45 to 70 of the Constitution are worded so that the National Assembly can remove the president constitutionally, whereas the president can remove the National Assembly only unconstitutionally, only by setting aside the Constitution itself. This is true in America too. Here, therefore, it challenges this forcible destruction. It not only sanctifies the division of powers like the Charter of 1830, which it widens into an intolerable contradiction. The play of the constitutionary powers, as Guizot termed the parliamentary squabble between the legislative and executive power, is in the Constitution of 1848 continually played va-banque, staking all. On one side are 750 representatives of the people elected by universal suffrage and eligible for re-election. They form an uncontrollable, indivisible National Assembly. A National Assembly that enjoys legislative omnipotence, decides the last instance upon war, peace, and commercial treaties, which, by the way, while in endorsing the frankly neoconservative theory of the unitary executive proposed by Nixon and really codified by Bush, Chris is actually also ignoring that part of the conditions that led to this power was Congress abrogating its own power of war and policing in the Police Powers Acts of the 1960s. Chris doesn't mention that in his abrogation of powers because it can't be tied into the claim of the unitary executive. The Congress overpowered the executive so they didn't have to take responsibility, and then underpowered it by making the departments created under the executive independent of executive rule. That's a dialectical two-step of which Chris only mentions one side in his defense of Trump. And is it a defense of Trump? It's hard to say. I mean, that last caveat at the end, but why would you argue for the unitary executive as maybe right if you did not at least extend it as a possibility? And why Hage, yes, are you endorsing Bonapartism or not? Do you think the crisis of Bonapartism will form the formation of a socialist party or not? And if you do think that, state it explicitly. As communists do not hide their names, intentions, and values. Go back and read your manifesto, as I just did today. However, therefore, let's go back to the case here. We're not talking about the manifesto. We're talking about the Brumaire. Here, therefore, it challenges its forcible destruction. Not only it sanctifies the division of powers, but we've already talked about this. A National Assembly that enjoys legislative on-opponents, decides in last instance on war, peace, and commercial treaties, but also possesses the right of amnesty and by pertinence, perpetually holds the front of the stage. On the other hand is the president, with all the attributes of world power, with the authority to appoint and dismiss its members independently of the National Assembly. Yes, it does. And that's true for us in the executive too. With all the resources of executive power in its hands, bestowing all posts and deposing and deposing thereby in France all the livelihoods of at least 1.5 million people. For so many depend on the 500,000 officials and officers of every rank. This is why there was an attempt to stabilize the administrative state. It's this contradiction right here. He has the whole of the armies behind him. He enjoys the privilege of pardoning individual criminals, of suspending the National Guard, of discharging with the coincidence of the Council of State, General and Canonical and Municipal Councils elected by citizens themselves. Initiative and direction are reserved to him in all treaties with foreign countries. With the Assembly constantly performs on boards and is exposed to daily criticism, he leads a secluded life in the Elysian fields with that Article 55 of the Constitution before his eyes and in his heart, crying to him daily, Frère, il faut mourir, brother, one must die. Your power ceases on the second Sunday of the lovely month of May in the 4th year after your election. Then your glory is at an end, your peace is not played twice, and you have your debts. Look to it quickly that you pay them off with the 6,000 francs granted to you by the Constitution, unless perchance you prefer to go to the clinky. And on the second Monday of the lovely of the month of May, thus, whereas the Constitution assigns the powers to the president, it seeks to secure moral power to the National Assembly. Apart from that fact, it is impossible to create moral power by the paragraphs of law. Again, this agrees with what Chris says, this part right here, because it's true. The Constitution here abrogates itself once more by having the president elected by all Frenchmen through direct suffrage, which is not true in the United States. Yes, the president is elected nationally, but it is not directed by direct suffrage of all people. It's directed by state suffrage. So there is that. After all, who votes is a matter of states' rights in the U.S., not federal. While the votes of France are split up among several 150 members of the National Assembly, there are, on contrary, concentrated on a single individual. While each separate representative of the people represents only this or that party, this or that town, this or that bridgehead, and only on the mere necessity of electing someone as the 7,050th, without examining too closely the cause of the man, he is the elect of the nation, and the act of his election is the trump that the sovereign people plays once every 4 years. The elected National Assembly stands in a metaphysical relation, but the elected president in personal relation to the nation. The elected National Assembly indeed exhibits its individual representatives in the manifold aspects of the national spirit, but in the president and the national spirit finds its incarnation. Against this assembly, he possesses a sort of divine right. He is president by the grace of the people. Theseus, the sea goddess, prophesies to Achilles that he would die in the bloom of his youth. The Constitution, which like Achilles has its weak spot, and also had like Achilles a presentiment which must go into early death. It is sufficient for the Constitution-making pure Republicans to cast a glance from the lofty heavens of their ideal republic to the profane world of how the ignorance of the royalists, the Bonapartists, the Democrats, the communists, as well as to their own discredit, grew daily the same measure as they approached the completion of the great legislative work of art. Without Theseus on the account having to leave the sea and communicate the secret with them, they sought to cheat by destiny by catch in the Constitution through Article 3, according to which every motion of revision of the Constitution must be supported by at least 3/4 of the votes, which is still true in the United States, by the way. Cast in their 3 successive debates with the entire month between each, with each provided provision of no less than 500 members of the National Assembly must vote. Thereby, they merely made the impotent attempt to continue exercising power, only a parliamentary minority, as which they already saw themselves prophetically in mind's eye, a power at the time when they commanded the parliamentary majority, and all resources of governmental authority was daily slipping more and more to their feeble hands. Finally, the Constitution, in the melodramatic paragraph, entrusts to the vigilance and patriotism of the whole French people and every single Frenchman, has its previously entrusted to another paragraph the vigilant and patriotic to the tender, most painstaking care of the High Court of Justice, the haute cour invented for this purpose. And again, we find a similar contradiction in the U.S. Constitution. Such was the Constitution of 1848, which on December of 1851 was overthrown not by head, but fell down by mere of a hat. This hat, to be sure, the three-cornered Napoleonic hat. When the bourgeois Republicans in the Assembly were busy devising, discussing, and voting on this Constitution, Cavaignac outside the Assembly maintained the state of siege of Paris. The state of siege of Paris was the midwife of the Constituent Assembly in its travails of Republican creation. As the Constitution is subsequently put out of existence by bayonets, it must not be forgotten that it was likewise by bayonets and thus turned against the people that it had to be protected in its mother's room, and by bayonets that brought it into existence. The forefathers of respectable Republicans sent their symbol, the tricolor, on tour around Europe. They themselves produced an invention that itself made its way to the whole continent, but returned to France whenever renewed love made it until it nationalized in half in her departments a state of siege. A splendid invention periodically employed in every ensuing crisis in the course of the French Revolution. But Varick and Volvac, I don't know how to say that, thus was periodically laid on the French society, had to compress its brain and render it quiet. Sabre and musket, which had periodically allowed to act as judges and administrators, as guardians and censors, should play policemen and do the night watchman's duty. Mustache and uniform, which were periodically triumphed forth as the highest wisdom of society and its vector, were not the Barrack and Bobak, sabre and musket, mustache and uniform bound to hit upon the idea of instead serving society once and for all by proclaiming their own regime as the highest and freeing civil society completely from the form of governing itself? Barrack and Bobak, sabre and musket, mustache and uniform were bound to hit upon this idea, all the more as they might have expected better cash payments for higher service, whereas mere periodic state of siege and the mere transient rescues of society at the bidding of this or that bourgeois action, little substance was gleaned save killed and wounded in some friendly bourgeois grimaces. Should not the military at last one day play a state of siege in their own interest and for their own benefit, at the same time besiege the citizens' purses? Moreover, it is noted in passing, one must not forget that Colonel Bernard, the same military commissioner who went under Cavaignac, had 50,000 insurgents deported without trial, and is at this moment again at the head of the military commission active in Paris. Whereas the state of siege in Paris, the respectable, pure Republicans planted the nursery, the Praetorians of December 1851 were to grow up. They, on the other hand, deserve praise for the reason that, instead of exaggerating the national sentiment as under Louis Philippe, they now, when they had the command of the national power, crawled before foreign countries, and instead of setting Italy free, let her be reconquered by the Austrians and the Neapolitans. Louis Bonaparte's selection as president on December 10th, 1848, put an end to the dictatorship of Cavaignac and the Constituent Assembly. In the Article 44 of the Constitution, it stated, the president of the French Republic must never lose his status as a French citizen. The first president of the French Republic, Alain Bonaparte, had not merely lost his status as a French citizen. He had not only been an English special constable, but he was naturalized Swiss. So I have worked out everywhere the significance of the election of December 10th. I will not revert to it here. It is significant to remark that it is a mere reaction of the peasants, which had to pay the cost of February Revolution, against the remaining classes of the nation. A reaction to the contrary against the town. It met with the approval of the army, with which Republicans of the National provided for neither glory nor additional pay, among the bourgeoisie, which held Bonaparte as a bridge to the monarchy, among the proletarians and the petty bourgeoisie, which held him as a scourge of Cavaignac. I shall have an opportunity later to go more closely into this relationship of the peasants to the revolution. From the period of December 20th, 1848, until the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly in 1849, and May 1849, comprises the history of the downfall of bourgeois republicans. After having founded a republic for the bourgeoisie, driven by the revolutionary proletariat out of the field, and reduced democratic petty bourgeoisie to silence for the time being, they themselves thrust aside by the mass of the bourgeoisie, which disempounds this republic as its property. The bourgeois mass, however, were royalist. One section of it, the landowners, had drawn during the Restoration and were accordingly legitimatists. The other, the aristocrats of finance and the big industrialists, have ruled in July monarchy and were consequently Orleanist. The high dignitaries of the army, university, and church, the bar, the academy, and the press were found on either side in various proportions. Here in the bourgeois republic, which bore neither the name Bourbon nor the name Orléans, but the name capital, which they found the form of the state in which they could rule conjointly. The June insurrection had already united them in the party of order. Now it was necessary in the first place to remove the coterie of bourgeois Republicans who still occupied the seats of the National Assembly. Just as brutal as the pure Republicans had in their misuse of the physical force against the people, just as cowardly and mealy-mouthed, broken-spirited, and incapable of fighting as they now were in retreat, when it was a question of maintaining Republican and their legislative rights against the executive power and the royalists, I now need not relate here the ignominious history of their dissolution. They did not succumb. They passed out of existence. The history did not end forever, and the history has come to an end forever, and both inside and outside the assembly, they figure in following only as memories. Memories that seem to regain life whenever the name Republic is once more the issue. As revolutionary conflicts threaten to sink down the lowest spirit, I must remark in passing that the journal which gave the name to this party, the National, was converted to socialism in the following period. Before we finish with this period, we must cast a retrospective glance at the two powers, which annihilated each other on December 2nd, 1851, whereas from December 20th, 1848, until the end of the Constituent Assembly, they had lived together in conjoinal relation. We mean Louis Bonaparte on one hand, and the other of the Cohost royalists, the party of order, the big bourgeoisie, on the other. Ascending to the presidency, Bonaparte was formed the ministry of the party of order, at the head of which he placed Odilon Barrot, the old leader, nota bene, of the most liberal faction of the parliamentary bourgeoisie. Monsieur Barrot had at least secured the ministerial portfolio whose image had haunted him since 1830, and what is more, the premiership in the ministry, but not, as he imagined under Louis Philippe, as the most advanced leader of the parliamentary opposition, but with the task of putting Parliament to death, and with the confederate of all his arch enemies, Jesuits and Legitimists. He brought the bride home at last, only after she had been prosecuted. Bonaparte seemed to efface himself completely. This party acted for him. The very meaning of the Council of Ministers resolved on the expedition to Rome, which agreed should be undertaken behind the back of the National Assembly, which means for to be arrested it under false pretenses. Thus began swindling the National Assembly and secretly conspiring to the absolutist abroad against the Revolutionary Republic. The Revolutionary Roman Republic. In the same manner and with the same maneuvers, Bonaparte prepared his coup of December 2nd against the Royalist Legislative Assembly and its constitutional republic. Let us not forget that the same party formed Bonaparte's ministry on December 20th, 1848, formed the majority of the Legislative National Assembly on December 2nd, 1851. All right, so a lot of that's not directly relevant, but a whole lot of it is. When we see here a skepticism of the separation of powers as creating unnecessary conflicts in the polycentric social order of the state. All right, that's pretty clearly something Marx picks up on, and it's a contradiction that can't be easily resolved. As throwing yourself against one part of the state to ends up helping another part in ways that lead to unwavering contradictions. Now, this should be studied, and I think Chris is right to point out that the pseudo left or the popular front left or whatever you want to call it is in itself backing one part of the state. It says it opposes a not particularly democratic part of the state, I may add, as a representative of democracy against another part of the state, which itself is democratic only partially. Now, the claim that these are all dictatorships and not dictatorship of the class as a whole, but separate dictatorships and the separation of powers, I see no justification for in either the Federalist Papers, the Anti-Federalist Papers, or in Marx. But Chris can enlighten me as to where he gets that from. So we can say here that I actually still stand by a lot of my claims that he's too soft on declarations of values from the right. But that he's right in critiquing liberal and leftist opportunism and abuse of law and their almost, frankly, fascistic use of Carl Schmitt's logic of friend and enemy and what that is doing to the system of law itself, because it is replicated by their enemies, and they also do it. So one sees a increasing degradation of norms in this constitutional republic, which seems inevitable in bourgeois society, both because of capital, but also stemming from its values being based on things that cannot be universalizable, as pointed to in the manifesto itself. I cannot reconcile this with all of Chris's claims, particularly claims about the unitary executive, or the nature of justice, or his unwillingness to define who that is. I also find some of the rhetorical slips rather slippery, and I'm surprised more people don't call them out. But instead of dealing with the arguments at hand, most people simply denounce Chris. Whether I agree with him or not, and there are things that I think could be deemed as unfair, as me calling the belief in the unitary executive as neoconservative as opposed to originalist, particularly given that there's an abrogation of power in both the Declaration of Independence and in stuff like the speech to the nation by George Washington, the Federalist Papers, etc. The arguments by assertion, particularly of Marx, bother me. When the text being parsed are not nearly as clear as the assertions being made about them, and often they aren't cited as where you can look them up either. Now, I happen to have listened to Chris Cutrone, who made this public, that Moshe Postone criticized him for making assertions and not always backing them up himself. So Chris has heard this before, but let me reiterate it. When you make claims about Marx, show your fucking work. Now, I've been criticized by fans of Chris for my passion. In fact, this was something Chris himself said about me. By the way, I'm aware of what people say about me in Platypus Affiliated Society. I still have friends in the organization. I know what's said to some degree. Yes, I am very passionate and very fighty, and that is a temperamental problem. But I do not find the faux implementation of Stoicism as a character mask to necessarily be virtuous itself either. Particularly when one does not have skin in the game while doing it. And until one starts to push for the building of such a party, indeed, Chris may be correct that we are stuck in this bind. But in which case, valorizing a dying bourgeois society hardly seems to be where this should really be going. And this is my first in a very long engagement with Chris Cutrone. I hope he takes this as a comradely criticism, even stated passionately. I have not attempted to misrepresent him in any way. And indeed, there's parts of this that I just want clarification on. Cite your work. I need to understand where you are getting your interpretations of. I do not accept your authority as a pedagogue in and of itself. You must prove that you are worthy. We are equals in this matter. I do not have a PhD behind my name, but then again, should it matter in this case? Have a good day. Like and subscribe. Come back for me arguing with other people. By the way, for the people who know, after I'm done with this series in the fall, I have extended a right of reply for Chris and anybody else from the Platypus Affiliated Society to come on the show and talk with me about my interpretations of their work, to show the work that I don't see here, because admittedly, this is a polemical piece. Not all the work's going to be here, but I want people to know that I took it seriously and thoroughly. I spent 2 hours and 30 minutes on this and about a day of research to make sure that I did not say anything untrue. Furthermore, when I read the relevant passages of Marx, I will admit some of these things are ambiguous. But I'm going to need clearer lines of interpretation and assertion for me to accept them. And particularly when one is claiming to be the representative of original Marxism, like every guru in this space does. This is a long tradition, one hardly worth defending. And I'll leave it at that.